Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the absolute most profound and, honestly, persistent paradoxes in human history. We're talking about religion. For centuries, religion has been wielded as a pretty devastating weapon of war, right? But then, at the exact same time, it served as one of our most profound instruments for peace. It's so easy to fall into the trap of trying to label it as inherently good or inherently evil. But the reality, well, it's way more fascinating than that. Religion is this deeply complex bundle of beliefs, rituals, institutions, and narratives. It's a literal double-edged sword. And to truly understand global conflicts and peace-building today, we've got to understand exactly how both of those edges get sharpened. Okay, let's just quickly look at our roadmap for today. First, we'll cover the ambivalence of religion. Second, power texts and nationalism. Third, radicalization in the digital age. Fourth, peace ethics and interreligious dialogue. And finally, education and the secular state. Let's dive in.
Starting off with Section 1, the ambivalence of religion, and why it's such a complex bundle.
You know, when we see conflicts in the news and they're labeled as religious, it's absolutely crucial to remember that they almost never arise from theology alone. Religion is incredibly entangled with things like political, economic, and historical factors. We're talking land disputes, resource scarcity, colonial legacies, and of course, social inequality. Which brings us to a really fundamental question. Is religion inherently violent or is it inherently peaceful? I want to challenge you to drop that binary thinking entirely. Saying religion is universally violent completely ignores decades of incredible on-the-ground peace-building and humanitarian work by religious actors. But on the flip side, saying it's universally peaceful naively ignores how religious institutions have historically actively legitimized violence and exclusion. To get to the truth, we really have to look deeper into the specific actors, the actual texts they're using, and the power dynamics at play in any given moment.
Think about it. Almost all major traditions contain these really profound peace motives, things like charity, mercy, nonviolence, and reconciliation. And yet, those exact same traditions can yield wars, persecution, exclusion, and absolute domination. How is that even possible? Well, it completely depends on who is interpreting the tradition and under what political conditions. A text can totally be read as a call to compassion, or if the political climate demands it, it can be read as a hard, impenetrable border between us and them.
Which brings us to Section 2, Power Texts and Nationalism.
So how do we actually get from ancient wisdom to modern political violence? When we look at how sacred texts are read, we generally see two main approaches. The first is literalism. This method heavily relies on decontextualization. It's essentially when someone isolates a single ancient quote entirely out of its specific historical context and then applies it as this timeless rule to legitimize violence against a modern group. But then, on the other hand, we have hermeneutics. Now, this is responsible historical contextualization. It looks at the broader tradition, the ethical boundaries, and the actual historical reality of the text. This approach actively promotes peace. It protects human dignity, and it fosters what we call ambiguity tolerance, which is the ability to handle complex realities without resorting to violence.
So the crucial point here is understanding exactly how these decontextualized texts are used for something called sacralization. This is a very specific, very powerful mechanism. Sacralization is when an actor takes a standard political goal, say a territorial dispute, and portrays it as holy, untouchable, or divinely willed. The second you frame a fight over resources as a holy duty, you completely change the nature of the dispute. Political opponents are no longer just folks you disagree with. They become literal existential threats to the divine order. And when the stakes are divine, well, compromise becomes practically impossible.
And this sacralization is exactly what fuels religious nationalism. This happens when national belonging gets tightly knotted to one dominant religion. So if you don't belong to that specific religion, you're immediately marked as less loyal, an outsider, or even a direct danger to the state. What's super fascinating and honestly pretty terrifying about religious nationalism is how it operates through what's called victimization competition. Basically, politically dominant groups will claim that their identity is existentially threatened by minorities. They use this whole narrative of being the true victims to justify preventative aggression and exclusionary laws against people who, in reality, hold way less power.
Moving on to Section 3, Radicalization in the Digital Age.
So how are these ancient mechanisms of exclusion functioning today? Well, the digital landscape acts as a massive accelerant, specifically through the concept of the echo chamber. You see, social media algorithms are designed for one thing:
engagement. And nothing drives engagement quite like anger and disgust. These platforms effectively push vulnerable individuals into communication environments where only confirming, extreme opinions circulate. Inside an echo chamber, complex religious traditions are completely stripped of all their nuance. They get reduced to highly emotional, totally out of context memes. And any contradictory information, it's instantly tossed out as enemy propaganda. And this all builds into a really predictable digital radicalization pathway. It almost always begins with step one, a genuine personal grievance, a sense of being marginalized, or just a deep search for belonging. Extremist narratives swoop in and offer these absolute answers to that pain. Then comes step two, the isolation of the echo chamber. That absolute answer gets reinforced 24/7. Which brings us to step three, the dehumanization of opponents. The entire complex world gets boiled down to this epic battle of absolute purity versus absolute corruption. Personal grievances get manipulated until the individual actually accepts violence, not just as an option, but as a purifying duty.
All right, let's pivot a bit for Section 4, Peace, Ethics, and Interreligious Dialogue.
Because just as religion can be weaponized, it also provides its own profound antidotes to violence through peace ethics. These ethics actively set strict moral limits on violence, basically reminding us that just because something is militarily possible, that definitely doesn't make it permissible. They expand our circle of belonging to include the stranger, forcing us to actually see the humanity in our opponent. They also demand deep self-criticism rather than just pointing fingers and blaming the enemy, which pushes us to look at our own structural faults. And they promote communal ritual healing through things like public apologies, shared mourning and prayers, and those things deeply, deeply aid in de-escalating tension.
However, it's important to remember that responsible peace ethics are rigorous. They don't just demand a quick, sweeping forgiveness from victims while the actual abuse continues. There's this incredibly powerful concept that reminds us peace without justice can become merely the quiet of oppression. True, lasting religious peacebuilding requires addressing the actual root causes of a conflict. It demands truth, it demands accountability, and a real commitment to building structural justice. Otherwise, you aren't really building peace at all. You're just enforcing silence.
So how do we practically achieve this? Well, notice how the pathway of interreligious mediation actually mirrors the radicalization steps we just talked about, but in reverse. Step one is trust building. Step two requires the mutual recognition of suffering, truly seeing the pain of the other side. And step three is reconciliation. Very often, it's local religious actors, imams, priests, rabbis, community leaders, who can actually facilitate this. They possess this unique moral credibility and local trust that state institutions or outside politicians simply do not have.
Let's head into our final section, Section 5, Education and the Secular State. To maintain the delicate balance of religious freedom, and crucially, to prevent violence, we really can't just rely on individual goodwill. We need solid societal frameworks. For example, look at the physical safety of religious communities. International bodies like the UN urgently stress the protection of religious sites. Why is that? Because attacks on a mosque, a synagogue, or a church, they aren't just about property damage. They are acts of profound symbolic violence. They are explicitly designed to send a chilling message to an entire group that they are unsafe, that they are unwelcome, and that they should be erased from public life. So protecting these sites isn't just about protecting bricks and mortar. It's literally about protecting the pluralistic order of society itself. To actually achieve that protection, we need a comprehensive, multi-level peace strategy. General, vague appeals for tolerance, they simply aren't enough when communities are actively under threat. We have to enforce strict legal equality and minority protection laws. We absolutely must integrate robust religious and media literacy education into our schools. We need to implement proportional security concepts that protect communities without turning their places of worship into militarized zones. And we've got to cultivate an inclusive culture of remembrance, one that honestly acknowledges historical trauma and past violence without weaponizing it for present-day agendas.
A massive part of that education strategy revolves around this really vital concept, ambiguity tolerance. This is our ability to endure complexity, multiple meanings, and uncertainty without panicking and fleeing straight into simple, absolutist enemy stereotypes. Religious and media literacy actively builds this exact muscle. It helps us see right through manipulative online imagery, it stops us from dehumanizing others, and it allows us to hold differing worldviews in tension without resorting to violence.
The ultimate framework to support all of this is the state itself. When a state strictly controls or privileges one specific religion, it almost inevitably leads to the marginalization of minorities. But a secular state, it acts as a neutral referee. Now, to be clear, a secular state is not anti-religion.
Rather, it guarantees equal rights for everyone by protecting both the freedom of religion, meaning your right to practice as you choose, and the freedom from religion, ensuring that no single group can ever monopolize state power or force its beliefs onto others.
We've covered a ton of ground today, all the way from the sacred texts of antiquity to the algorithms shaping our digital present. Religion is this incredibly complex, immensely powerful force that can absolutely be manipulated to divide us, but it can also be harnessed to heal us. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to take into your everyday life. How can you cultivate your own ambiguity tolerance to resist the simplistic, divisive propaganda circulating in your own digital environment? Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with me today, and keep questioning the narratives around you.